The date was April 3rd, 1942. As the first pale rays of a Tennessee sunrise touched the rural landscape 23 miles northeast of Chattanooga, a heavy, rhythmic thud began to vibrate through the red clay. It wasn't the sound of thunder, nor was it the sound of war. Not yet. At exactly 6:47 a.m., a stream of liquid grey concrete poured into a foundation pit in a quiet stretch of farmland. There were no politicians giving speeches. No brass bands played the Star-Spangled Banner. No photographers from Life magazine stood by to document what would become the most vital and perhaps the most dangerous construction project of the 20th century. In that moment, the valley was just a collection of cotton fields and quiet woodlands. But within 18 months, this empty space would be transformed into an industrial leviathan. It would breathe fire and exhale poison, producing a volume of explosive material that surpassed any facility in human history. The men and women who stood there that morning, their boots covered in Tennessee mud, had no idea they were laying the first brick of an altar to mass destruction. The United States government made sure of that. Information was the only thing more volatile than the chemicals they were about to handle. If you have ever wondered how the tides of World War II truly turned, if you've ever suspected that the victory wasn't just won by generals in maps rooms, but by the anonymous sweat of people who never saw a headline, then you're in the right place. We are peeling back the rusted layers of the arsenal of democracy to reveal the forgotten machinery of victory. This secret city was officially designated the Volunteer Ordnance Works, or VOW, but to the locals it was simply the Works, or VW. The name was intentionally bland, designed to disappear into the bureaucracy of the War Department. At its zenith, the facility would swallow 16 square miles of land. Think about that. 16 square miles dedicated to a single, terrifying purpose. Every day, 40,000 workers would disappear behind its high, electrified fences. The majority of them were women who, only weeks prior, had been tending gardens or raising children. These workers were stepping into a world they didn't understand. They were handling one of the most unstable and treacherous chemical compounds ever mass-produced by man. By the end of the conflict in 1945, this single valley had churned out a staggering 823 million pounds of trinitrotoluene, TNT. This isn't a figure of speech or a historical exaggeration. It is a cold, hard fact recorded in the dusty ledgers of the War Production Board, now hidden away in the National Archives in Maryland. 823 million pounds. To visualize that, you have to imagine every single artillery shell fired by an American M2 howitzer in the forests of Germany. Every 500-pound bomb dropped from the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress over Tokyo. Every underwater mine that shattered Japanese hulls in the Pacific. Nearly every single ounce of that destructive power traced its lineage back to this Tennessee soil. To grasp the sheer desperation behind VOW, we must look at the grim reality of December 1941. The smoke from Pearl Harbor hadn't just signaled a military defeat. It exposed a terrifying structural rot in America's industrial skeleton. For years, the US had clung to the comfort of neutrality, allowing its munitions industry to wither into nothingness. When the Japanese Zero struck, the American military had a stockpile of fewer than 50 million pounds of TNT. In the context of global mechanized warfare, that was barely a 6-month supply. Britain was exhausted, her stockpiles depleted by 3 years of relentless fighting. The Soviet Union was screaming for help as German panzers rolled toward Moscow. America found itself in a nightmare scenario. It had the men, it had the planes, but it had no teeth. Without explosives, a tank is just an expensive steel coffin. A bomber is just a heavy transport plane. A battleship is nothing more than a floating target. You cannot win a modern war without the chemistry of death. And in 1942, America's chemistry set was empty. The solution wasn't going to be a scientific miracle. It was going to be brutal, raw scale. The government needed to manufacture more TNT than the world had ever seen, and they needed it yesterday. The Army Corps of Engineers scoured the map and settled on Tennessee for 3 strategic reasons that would define the fate of the region. The first was power. TNT production is an energy glutton. It requires a massive, constant, and unfailing supply of electricity. Any surge or drop in power could cause the chemical reactors to fail, leading to instability, and instability meant the end of everything for miles around. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, promised a grid that would never flicker. The second was water. The Chickamauga Reservoir was an ocean of cooling potential. Millions of gallons would be sucked out every hour to temper the violent chemical reactions and dissolve the lethal compounds. The third reason was the most chilling: isolation, the calculus of acceptable loss. The Army chose this valley because if, or when, something went catastrophically wrong, the resulting shockwave would dissipate in the woods before it could level the city of Chattanooga. They were building a volcano, and they wanted it far from the crowds. Construction began with a ferocity that bordered on madness. The J.A. Jones Construction Company was told they had 8 months to finish a project that should have taken 3 years. There were no excuses. In wartime, a delay wasn't a financial penalty. It was a death sentence for a soldier on the other side of the planet. As the sun set on those first days of construction, the local farmers watched the horizon glow with the lights of thousands of workers. They didn't know that the world they knew was gone forever. They didn't know that their quiet valley was now the beating heart of a global war machine. By the spring of 1943, the Volunteer Ordnance Works was no longer a construction site. It was a hungry, breathing industrial beast. But this beast didn't eat coal or wood. It consumed human health. As the buses rolled into the facility gates every morning, thousands of women stepped off, ready to trade their safety for a paycheck of 54 cents an hour. Most of them were greens, fresh recruits from the Appalachian foothills who had never seen the inside of a factory, let alone a high-stakes chemical nitration plant. The air inside the production zones wasn't just air. It was a thick, citrus-smelling haze. To a newcomer, the smell was almost pleasant, like sweet benzene or rotting almonds. That was the scent of toluene, a hydrocarbon stripped from coal and oil. But within hours, that sweetness turned into a crushing headache. Within days, it turned into nausea. And within weeks, it began to change their very biology. This is where the legend of the Canary Girls of Tennessee began. It started with the hands. No matter how much they scrubbed with harsh lace soap, the palms of their hands turned a vivid, sickly shade of lemon yellow. Then it spread to their wrists, their faces, and even their hair. Some women with blonde hair found their locks turning a bright neon orange. The management told them it was a badge of honor. They said it was just a surface stain that would wash off after the war. They were lying. The yellow staining was a signal that the trinitrotoluene was saturating their skin and binding to the keratin. But more importantly, it was being absorbed into their bloodstreams. Inside the nitration buildings, the process was a violent chemical marriage. Toluene was forced to react with concentrated sulfuric and nitric acids. This reaction released nitrogen dioxide, a heavy orange gas that hung in the rafters like a toxic ghost. The workers called it the glow. When you breathed the glow, your lungs burned. Your blood began to change. According to declassified medical journals from the mid-1940s, the TNT was performing a silent massacre inside their bodies. It attacked the red blood cells, causing a rapid onset of toxic anemia. In the worst cases, it led to aplastic anemia, a terrifying condition where the bone marrow simply gives up and stops producing blood entirely. Their bodies were literally forgetting how to live. The government knew. The internal memos of the US Public Health Service, hidden for decades, recorded over 1,200 cases of acute TNT poisoning at VOW alone. But the war machine couldn't stop. The demand for £823 million of explosives meant that a few hundred yellow girls were an acceptable casualty of the home front. If a woman collapsed, she was sent to the infirmary, given a glass of milk, which was falsely believed to neutralize the acid, and often quietly discharged. There were no pensions for the poisoned. There were no medals for the women whose livers failed before they reached the age of 30. Yet they kept coming. For a woman in rural Tennessee, in 1943, 54 cents an hour was a fortune. It was independence. It was the ability to buy a house, to feed children whose fathers were fighting in the Pacific, to feel like they were part of something larger than their small, quiet lives. They became a sisterhood of the yellow-stained, sharing a secret language of exhaustion and toxic exposure that the rest of the world would never truly understand. If you worked at the Volunteer Ordnance Works in 1944, the first thing you learned wasn't how to make a bomb. It was how not to become one. The discipline was absolute, bordering on the religious. At the main gate, there was a line of death. Before crossing it, every worker, man or woman, was subjected to a rigorous search. Matches, lighters, and even fountain pens were confiscated. A single spark in the wrong zone wouldn't just kill the worker, it would trigger a chain reaction that could vaporize 16 square miles of Tennessee. The workers wore powder suits, specialized uniforms without pockets, buttons, or metal zippers. Pockets were forbidden because they could hide contraband, or worse, accumulate toxic TNT dust that could ignite later. They wore conductive shoes, stitched with copper wire to bleed off static electricity into the grounded floors. Inside the factory, static was the invisible assassin. The heart of the danger was the nitration house. These were massive multi-story buildings designed with a strange architectural feature. The walls were reinforced concrete, but the roofs were made of light, flimsy wood. Why? Because if an explosion occurred, the pressure needed a path of least resistance. The roof would blow upward into the sky, hopefully leaving the thick walls standing to protect the neighbouring buildings. It was a cold, calculated design that told every worker, if this place goes, you go with the roof. Inside, the environment was a clockwork nightmare. The women stood before massive steel vats where toluene was mixed with oleum, a terrifyingly concentrated sulfuric acid. The temperature had to be monitored every single second. If the needle on the thermometer crept just a few degrees too high, the mixture would enter a runaway reaction. In those moments, the air would turn a dark, bruised purple. The only choice was to pull the dump lever, sending thousands of gallons of boiling, half-finished TNT into a deep drowning tank filled with cold water. It was a race against a chemical fuse that had no visible flame. The stress was so intense that many workers suffered from the shakes, a form of industrial shell shock, where their hands wouldn't stop trembling even after their shift ended. But the clock never stopped. The front lines in Europe were screaming for more. At VOW, they ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There were no holidays. There was only the hum of the turbines, the smell of acid, and the constant ticking fear that today might be the day the roof finally met the sky. For all the rigid discipline and copper-wired shoes, the volcano of Tennessee was bound to erupt. On the night of November 14th, 1942, the nightmare finally arrived at Building 12. Inside, a massive tank held 8,000 pounds of molten liquid TNT, a searing golden soup of pure destruction. It only took one mechanical failure, one valve that refused to turn, one moment of heat that surpassed the breaking point. The resulting blast didn't just break windows, it physically moved the earth. People in Chattanooga, 23 miles away, felt the shockwave in their bones. They thought it was an earthquake or a long-range German bombing raid. When the smoke cleared, Building 12 was gone. In its place was a jagged crater 14 feet deep. 6 men were vaporized instantly. Their bodies weren't just destroyed, and they were integrated into the landscape of the factory they helped build. But as the war machine roared on, the news of the tragedy was suppressed. The War Department didn't want the nation to know how fragile the arsenal of democracy really was. A short, vague paragraph in the local newspaper was all the public received. The names of the dead were quickly buried under the next day's production quotas. However, there was a deeper, darker layer to the tragedy at VOW that the history books rarely mention: the shadow workers. In 1942, the American military was a segregated institution, and so was the Volunteer Ordnance Works. While white women handled the chemistry, black workers, mostly men from the Deep South, were assigned the dirty zones. They were the ones tasked with cleaning the massive acid tanks, handling the raw, on burning chemicals without the same protective gear, and working in the areas where the risk of explosion was highest. They lived in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and yet breathed the same toxic glow. If a white woman's skin turned yellow, it was a badge of honor. If a black man's skin changed or his lungs failed, he was often simply replaced. The story of VOW is often told as a triumph of American industry, but you cannot tell it truthfully without acknowledging that the £823 million of TNT were bought with the lives of people who were denied basic rights in the very country they were saving. They were the invisible backbone of the explosion, working in the shadows of the very bombs that would soon light up the skies of Europe. As the war entered its final stages in 1945, the factory hit a fever pitch. The workers were exhausted, their bodies saturated with poison, but the yellow curse had become a way of life. They didn't know that the end was near, and they certainly didn't know that the true cost of their labour would only be revealed decades later, when the factory was gone, but the poison remained in the soil. In August 1945, the world celebrated. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the gears of the volcano of Tennessee finally ground to a halt. The 40,000 workers were sent home with a handshake, a final paycheck, and a lifetime of yellow-stained memories. But as the iron gates of VOW closed, a new, slower catastrophe began to unfold. For 3 years, the factory had exhaled £823 million of TNT. But where did the waste go? The answer lies in the red water. During production, millions of gallons of cooling water were contaminated with nitrocrysols and sulfuric acid, turning the local streams a dark, unnatural crimson. The government's solution was simple: bury it. They dug massive unlined pits and filled them with toxic sludge, believing the earth would simply swallow the poison. They were wrong. By the 1970s, the soil at the former WWII site was so saturated with explosives that it was classified as a Superfund site, one of the most contaminated places in America. If you dug a hole in certain spots, the dirt could actually ignite. The water tables were laced with carcinogens, and the Quiet Valley had become a ticking environmental time bomb. But the most heartbreaking legacy wasn't in the dirt. It was in the people. Clara Bishop, one of the last surviving Canary Girls, spoke in her final years about the price they paid. "We didn't think about the cancer," she whispered in a 1990s interview. "We didn't think about why our children had skin rashes or why our friends died young. We just thought about the boys in the Pacific." Clara and thousands of others were never given a parade. Their names aren't carved into the marble of Washington, D.C., or monuments. Instead, their sacrifice is etched into the very DNA of the Tennessee landscape. Today, much of the site is an industrial park or a nature preserve, but the signs are still there: the rusted pipes, the concrete foundations of the nitration houses, and the eerie silence of the shadow zones. The story of the Volunteer Ordnance Works is a reminder that victory is never clean. It is a messy, toxic, and often forgotten struggle that happens far from the front lines. The £823 million of TNT won the war, but they left a scar on the American heart that has yet to fully heal. As we look back at the rusted ruins of Building 12, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to sacrifice for security? The Canary Girls gave their beauty, their health, and sometimes their lives. They were the anonymous alchemists of freedom, turning their own bodies yellow so the world could remain free. And that is a story that should never be buried in the red clay of Tennessee.